This week, Calgary City Council voted 12-3 to repeal blanket rezoning. Not repeal and replace for now, just repeal, as in remove the policy and go back in time to what it was. But wait, while the repeal did pass, some of its elements remain and were not repealed. And this has not been widely reported on, if at all. But I watched and deciphered the entire day and week of voting and debate and heated arguments and the sign off so that you didn't have to. And right now, I'm going to sum up what was repealed, what remains, and what it means for Calgary going forward. I'm Kelly Doody, Calgary realtor, former journalist, and civic nerd. I've been tracking this story from the beginning, so let's get into it. Now, it's hard to overstate just how significant this issue and this outcome is. This week's decisions, they touch on every homeowner, every buyer, every renter, and every neighborhood in Calgary. But I also want to tell you something that I think might be the most important and perhaps understated piece about it all. This story is certainly about rezoning and development, but actually it's very much about trust. It's about who gets to shape this city, our city, and whether ordinary Calgarians actually have a say. To understand this week's significance, you have to understand what drove the big blanket rezoning discussion and issue in the first place, and the 2024 bylaw that enabled it. Calgary has grown fast. In our last decade alone, our population grew by 28%. That's roughly 350,000 people that are now also calling this city home. Alberta has had the highest interprovincial migration rate in Canada for 3 years running. We're not a small town anymore. Our housing supply was not keeping pace. Rents were climbing. First-time home buyers were getting priced out. Downsizers couldn't afford to find suitable options in the neighborhoods that they'd lived in for years. And the city was sprawling outward, expanding at the edges, adding roads and pipes and emergency services, infrastructure costs that had ultimately landed on taxpayers. And at the same time, the federal government was pushing municipalities to reform their zoning and offered real money to help, as in housing funding tied to density commitments. So in 2024, Calgary City Council decided to act, and they went big. In May of 2024, Council voted 9-6 to pass rezoning for housing, also known as blanket rezoning. The largest public hearing in Calgary's history preceded it. 15 days, over 100 hours, 736 speakers at a cost of $1.3 million. Despite immense opposition and, frankly, a great deal of confusion and frustration and misunderstanding from the public, Council voted 9-6 in favor, and the policy screamed into effect just months later in August 2024. What the policy did at its core was change the default zoning across nearly every residential neighborhood in Calgary to what they called RCG, residential grade-oriented infill. In plain terms, on essentially any residential lot, you could now build a duplex or a townhouse or even a mid-block eightplex without a separate zoning application or rezoning application. Before this change, most established Calgary neighborhoods were limited to single-family or semi-detached homes, also known as R1 and R2, where one residential dwelling, sometimes two, were allowed. And if you wanted to build some kind of row housing or fourplex, you went through a pretty lengthy individual process. Blanket rezoning removed that barrier citywide, and then very quickly the changes showed up. Development applications and approvals exploded. Infill projects ramped up in established communities, and multi-unit buildings went up on streets that weren't really designed for that kind of density. Parking got tighter. Alleys got busier. Properties lost privacy and views, and in some cases, value. For a lot of Calgarians, these were not hypothetical concerns anymore. They were happening right in their backyard. And through all of it, the affordability improvements that were promised as one of the primary justifications for the policy were not showing up in the data or the outcomes. Sure, a lot of million-dollar infills and fancy modern fourplexes went up, but they weren't really priced for the people that these policies were intended for. And as well, a massive percentage of them were purpose-built rentals, which were good for renters, but not helpful for first-time homebuyers trying to get into the market. So when a new mayor and council came in at the end of 2025, they're forced to face some tough questions about whether any of it actually worked. It was a question looming so large over our city for a year and a half, causing such immense and immediate change that it was one of the primary platform issues that many of the candidates ran on. And new Mayor Jeremy Farkas promised Calgarians that it would be addressed as soon as possible in his new term. And that is exactly what brings us to this week and the giant vote put before council as to whether to repeal, as in eliminate and erase the blanket zoning legislation or leave it in place. But before they could do that, of course, they had to hear from the public. So from March 23rd to April 7th, Council held the repeal hearing. 8 days, 411 speakers, nearly 3,300 written submissions. And in the end, approximately 77% of those who submitted or spoke were in support of a repeal. But here's what struck me about the hearing and the people making their case. It was not a room full of people who simply don't want change. Generally speaking, it was not wealthy boomers or NIMBYs or any of the other assumed stereotypes. It was level-headed, pragmatic Calgarians making a case for Calgary and whether or not the policy works for this city. Some of the most pointed repeal arguments came from people who seemed supportive of more housing options and more density, but who felt that the policy was fundamentally flawed in how it arrived. There was a recurring argument that the city benefits financially from density through increased tax revenue and developers benefit through profit margins that had become far easier to grab. But was the policy actually designed to serve ordinary Calgarians or just the interests at play? And the fact that it passed in 2024 despite massive public opposition only deepened that suspicion. And ever-increasing levels of frustration with the then mayor and council about several issues that no longer felt like the right priorities for everyday citizens. On the other side, supporters of blanket rezoning were equally clear. Reintroducing an application barrier on development and going back to the old days in the middle of a housing crunch, when Alberta still has the highest migration rate in the country, is not an inconsequential act. Putting any kind of bottleneck back in place now, supporters were arguing, is exactly the wrong move. And instead, they pushed for just improved infrastructure inside city limits to stop making it harder for homeowners and developers to build what the city desperately needs, which is more housing. And there's one additional argument that I heard that I want to highlight because I don't think it gets enough attention. When we debate density in Calgary, the conversation almost always centers on the established inner city communities. Hillhurst, Inglewood, Killarney, Capitol Hill, the places that visibly changed rapidly under blanket rezoning and even prior. But what about the newer far-flung communities like Livingston, Seaton, and Cornerstone, some of these newer suburban communities that were designed in an era where developers knew better than their 1970s, 80s, and 90s counterparts? They were built from the ground up as mixed-use, multi-density, transit-oriented communities. They're walkable. They have restaurants, daycares, offices, retail, hospitals, transit connections, all built in, and they have homes for every stage and age, from entry-level apartments to townhomes to detached homes of every size to retirement villas and seniors' residences. The new suburbs are actually doing the density work and very effectively. And they continue to get a bad rap, I might add, as just more mindless sprawl. Meanwhile, the communities in Calgary's so-called Middle Belt, Bonavista, Varsity, Oakridge, Haysboro, Lakeview, large lots, significant green space, single-family homes on wide streets. Those communities also require infrastructure, roads, water mains, emergency response, and the distance required to pass through them to get to what are now more population-dense outer communities is not small. Under a blanket rezoning repeal, these middle belt, middle-aged communities return to a status where that infrastructure investment is, of course, ongoing, but densification is not required in return. So one councillor put it this way: the inner city and the new suburbs are carrying the density load, and the middle belt in some ways gets to have it both ways. So this is not a new tension in Calgary planning or development discourse, of course, but it's a real one, and it's worthy of some mindset adjustment, I think, when it comes to these blanket statements about the burbs that are today, in fact, built far better, designed as these future-proof areas, more so than people realize. But back to Wednesday's vote and the repeal that passed 12-3 on first reading. That was followed by a lengthy afternoon-evening session that involved a whole lot of possible amendments. Basically, a discussion of whether any of the pieces of the 2024 blanket rezoning legislation should remain or it should be wiped clean entirely. And then a second and a third reading and the finalized vote. My favorite part of the day's events, though, I think mostly because I count myself among those people who've grown really tired of fighting for things alongside their community members only to feel like they have zero impact, was how Mayor Farkas framed the vote in the simplest of terms. It was about restoring trust. He frequently noted that many Calgarians felt with the previous decision to adopt blanket rezoning so quickly and unilaterally, all trust in the city's planning process had been broken. And Councillor McLean put it more directly, saying that perhaps the biggest barriers to building more housing in Calgary is not in zoning, it's in City Hall, it's in city administration, it's in our own processes and delays. And that's quite something because it highlights that perhaps the problem was never only about what zoning said on paper. It's about how the city actually functions and how long approvals take, how predictable the process is for citizens and builders, and how much red tape exists regardless of what the zoning says. On the flip side, the councillors who voted against the repeal did so because they felt that repealing wouldn't help address the issues that residents have actually been raising: parking, tree canopy loss, overdensification, shrinking setbacks from roads and sidewalks and neighbors. And it doesn't undo RCG townhomes or complexes that are already approved or built. It simply returns the city to a world where those housing types are still allowed to be built. They just require a lengthy application and approvals process again. And one person captured it all quite well in saying that maybe the existing policy needed a renovation and not a whole new build. That may well be true, but the renovation wasn't supposed to be on the table this week. A full repeal was, and 12 councillors needed to decide whether going back to square one and then rebuilding something from the ground up was the right call. So what does this week's decision actually mean? Well, first, nothing changes immediately. The redesignation of roughly 306,000 Calgary properties doesn't take effect until August. Until then, the current rules still apply. Second, RCG development is not gone. Duplexes, townhomes, infills, these can still happen, but they will now require a zoning application and typically a council public hearing. That process takes time and it costs money. It'll slow things down. And whether that's a pro or a con depends on your perspective. Third, and this was the elephant in the room that was purposely left for another day in discussion by council, but it also is material, and it has been throughout this entire blanket rezoning debate and the repeal idea. And that is the $861 million in federal housing funding allocated to Calgary that carries some risk depending on how this repeal is interpreted by Ottawa. CMHC has made it clear that it assesses compliance on housing outcomes, not any single zoning tool, but that is not a closed question and it will need to be watched. Fourth, the post-vote debate, which was heated and it went right until 9 p.m., produced a confirmed set of outcomes on the rules going forward. And here's the counterintuitive thing. Going all the way back to pre-2024 zoning rules, a full repeal and so-called pure reset would actually mean reverting back to a few not great policies. For example, the former parking requirement of only half a stall per dwelling unit, which is less parking than what Calgarians said they wanted throughout the recent hearings. So Councillor Chabot put forth an amendment on Wednesday night, well, prior to Wednesday, but it was discussed on Wednesday, that suggested keeping a 1-to-1 parking requirement in the outer communities, a 10-meter building height limit, and reduced lot coverage. After much debate centering around whether that keeps this a full repeal or just another confusing on-the-fly, council-made hybrid, Chabot's version won. So the zoning bylaw that will apply to future applications after August 2026, when the repeal takes effect, is actually somewhat tighter than what existed before blanket rezoning, intended to respond to what Calgarians just asked for. But it's confusing if you're hearing Mayor and Council repeatedly state the importance of rebuilding trust and letting the citizens shape policy through due process. Remember, this week's vote was supposed to be a straight repeal decision, not a repeal and replace or repeal and tweak yet. That process lies ahead. But at the same time, seeing Chabot's recommendation pass was understandable given that some of the elements of the 2024 blanket rezoning policy did in fact fix a few more things than I think many of us realized. It actually mandated more parking, less building height, and less total coverage of new buildings than prior rules. Which is ironic, given that it also opened the doors to mass development. So it's confusing for us outsiders for certain. But regardless, it means that if you're building a dwelling in Calgary sometime after August 2026, when the repeal takes effect, you can't just go back to following the old bylaws. You need to understand which elements of the blanket rezoning policy actually still remain. And fifth, and this is the opposite, where a full repeal did take place and it affects individual homeowners with plans to add a suite to their property. Right now, with blanket rezoning in play through August, you can still have a secondary suite in both your basement and your backyard, a garage and a laneway suite on the same property, both at once. But in this week's proceedings, an amendment that would have kept that flexibility in place was defeated. So under the zoning that most established area properties are returning to in August, it goes back to either or. You can have one or the other, but not both types of suites. There are only about 400 backyard suites in the entire city right now, so this affects a small number of people at this exact moment. But if you had been planning to eventually add both, or you're buying a property with that in mind, the clock matters. Talk to someone and get your application in before August. One additional thing to watch regarding suites. Council voted 10-5 to hold a public hearing this July as well to answer the question of whether secondary suites and backyard suites should be automatically permitted uses in low density zones, meaning no lengthy development permitting process if you wanted to add one, which should make the process of building one of those two types of suites, not both, faster and cheaper for homeowners. So that hearing is scheduled for July 21st. In summary, the zoning legislation that came out of this week's repeal is actually somewhat tighter and arguably more anti-development than what existed before 2024. So if this was 2024, let's call it neutral, and this was blanket rezoning, free for all, we've gone back here, stricter. To the pro-development folks, that could be viewed as going doubly back in time. It hasn't really been publicly stated anywhere that I can tell, but it was not a blanket repeal and rather something in between, designed to respond to what 77% of the hearing attendees, the repeal crowd, said throughout the hearings. So yeah, we didn't just swing back to neutral. We swung even further in the other direction. But is it smarter? Probably. But make no mistake, it's a hybrid. And on that note, it's not final. This is the interim landing place. Every councillor who spoke on Wednesday, including those for and against the repeal, agreed that Calgary needs a new approach and a fresh policy, thoughtful density, community input, focused development where the infrastructure can actually support it. That's the conversation that we're all next invited to be a part of, and I'll be watching it closely. Like most people, I believe in density. I believe in walkable, mixed, vibrant communities and main streets. I've lived in Calgary's inner city and its suburbs, and I've seen what great urban design looks like. I understand why the 2024 policy was on the table, the housing crisis that drove it, and the pressure on affordability and supply that is not going away. Spend any time in downtown Calgary right now in the wee hours, and you will see more unhoused people than you ever imagined possible. And it's not okay, nor is it aligned with who we are as a city, in my opinion. But I also believe in trust and accountability. And I think something that got underweighted in 2024, and truthfully, the years leading up to it, was the relationship between council and the people who elected it. Thousands of Calgarians show up, from renters to retirees, community association members to young families, and they speak for days, not just on this issue, but so many others. And council votes in the opposite direction anyway, just based oftentimes on individual ideologies or textbook theories, not nuanced to our city. Something breaks. It doesn't matter whether the policy was good or not. The message it sent was, you don't have a voice, your participation doesn't change anything, and that wound feels like it's been festering in this city. I feel like it's eroded the spirit of it as a whole. We became far more polarized than at any time in recent memory, more angry, disenfranchised, insular. We rallied around our individual neighborhoods, not our city. And I think restoring that trust, even at the cost of some uncertainty in the short term, is a legitimate priority. And what gives me genuine optimism is that today's council across the spectrum seem to actually believe that something better can be built. They weren't celebrating the end of density. They were talking about stewardship versus static preservation. A city for the next generation. Thoughtful, targeted, community-grounded development that still attracts builders, but not the fly-by-night kind that leave the neighbors stunned and stuck with a 15-story high-rise that just doesn't fit. That's a different conversation than the one that we've been having. We are not Toronto. We're not Singapore or New York. Calgary is a particular place with a particular culture and set of values. And the homes we live in, the space we have, the neighborhoods we chose, those things matter here in ways that they don't everywhere else. And that's not a failure of ambition or progress. That's who we are. The challenge ahead is to find the version of density that is genuinely built for this city, not imported from somewhere else, and not imposed on its citizens, but built with us. I'm a fourth generation proud Calgarian and a realtor and former journalist, and I care very deeply about this city. If you want to understand more about what this week's decisions mean for your specific situation, whether you're buying, selling, investing, or halfway through building, I can help. Drop me a line and let's get to the bottom of it. Thank you for watching and stay engaged. This story is far from over.